Washington Journal continues.
And we're back. Our topic this morning, hate crime laws. Tim Lynch is the Criminal Justice Project Director for Cato Institute, and Winnie Stackelberg, External Affairs Senior Vice President for the Center for American Progress. Thank you both for being here. Winnie, if I can begin with you.
Sure.
We want to talk about whether or not hate crime laws are working. Are they?
Hate crime laws are working, and I think they're working for a couple of reasons. One, they send a very powerful signal, not only to the victim who's harmed by the criminal act, but to the community against which the crime is perpetrated. The other thing that we see is that local law enforcement really call for this extra tool that is provided to their ability to investigate and prosecute hate crime violence perpetrated against individuals and communities. So we see across the nation hate crimes laws are working both at the local, state, and federal level.
Does it show up in the data?
It does. We see a reduction in hate crime violence, but what you have to understand is there, say, against the gay and lesbian community, there are nearly 12,000 hate crimes that are perpetrated against the gay and lesbian community, a disproportionate number compared to the population of gay and transgendered people. So it's a problem that exists. Hate crime laws are a part of the solution, but they certainly can't solve all of the problem.
Tim Lynch, your opinion?
Well, hate crimes are a concept where it initially sounds like a good idea. Reducing the level of hatred in our society is certainly a desirable objective. But the closer you look at it, the more you think about it, you come to two conclusions. First, hate crimes laws are totally unnecessary. All the violent acts that you can think of against another person, I can assure you, is already against the law. So these hate crime laws are unnecessary. The second thing is they are not preventing any crime. Some of these laws are called the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, but they don't prevent anything, because when you think about it, anybody who's already inclined to stab another person, to shoot another person, they're not going to put down the gun or knife just because a state legislature has passed a new hate crimes law. Third, these laws are also problematic because I think it takes us too close to the idea of thought crimes, because in order to prove a hate crime, investigators and prosecutors have to prove what was going on in the person's mind when he was committing the crime. And that's very difficult often. So they have to delve into a person's background, and that takes us into, what magazines they subscribe to, what are their surfing habits on the internet, and all that's unnecessary because all these violent acts are already against the law.
What about Winnie's point, though, about the data? Because this is from the Detroit Free Press. Statistics show, however, that hate crimes have been steadily declining over the last decade. In 2010, we showed this to our viewers, more than 6,620 hate crimes were reported to the FBI, down a third from the roughly 9,700 reported in 2001.
Well, there are some problems with these statistics because not everybody can agree on what is considered to be a hate crime. So there's problems with these reporting statistics. And when you think about it, the more you talk about hate crimes, the more it fosters the idea that our laws are somehow inadequate to meet violent acts. And again, all these violent acts, whether it's murder, attempted murder, beating, assault, all of these things are already against the law, and police are vigorously enforcing these laws. So there is really no problem. I mean, once hate crimes laws are put on the books, they are going to be enforced, but there are these reporting problems.
You've written that this leads to a so-called protected class. What did you mean by that, and why is that a negative thing?
Well, when you talk about hate crimes laws, what I think we should be shooting for is we want even-handed enforcement of our laws. But when you have hate crimes laws, we're talking about establishing certain protected classes where these laws will be enforced against particular individuals. And if you're not a part of that protected class, then the hate crimes law doesn't apply to you. And I think this just creates more divisiveness in our society rather than less. So I think it's the wrong way to go.
All right.
If I could use a specific example. So in 1998, tragically, there were two very high-profile hate crimes. They were both murders. One of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, and the second Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming. And at the time, there was a federal hate crimes law on the book that covered race, religion, national origin, and ethnicity, but not sexual orientation. And so when the local law enforcement went to investigate and prosecute the crime in Jasper, Texas against James Byrd, a black man, the local law enforcement was able to apply to the federal government, to the Department of Justice, in help with forensics, help with the FBI, to help prosecute and close that case. It cost a lot of money to investigate and prosecute those crimes for Jasper, Texas, a very small community. However, in Laramie, Wyoming, with the hate crime against Matthew Shepard, which was perpetrated because of his sexual orientation, which was perfectly clear, the local law enforcement there in Laramie didn't have the ability to apply for a federal burn grant to help assist in the investigation and prosecution of that crime because sexual orientation was not included in federal hate crimes laws. So that has been changed with the passage of the Matthew Shepard Act. And so hate crimes laws not only are a preventative effort to ensure that there's a signal sent by the federal government that hatred against anyone is not okay, violence against anyone is not okay, but it also enables there to be a fair playing field and for local law enforcement to get the tools, the forensic help, the help that they need from the FBI and the Department of Justice to investigate and prosecute these crimes.
Tim Lynch, should federal law usurp state laws?
No, they shouldn't. These are the two most highly publicized incidents as offered as a justification for hate crimes laws. But when you look at what happened in the James Byrd case and the Matthew Shepard case in Wyoming, the perpetrators were quickly apprehended, they were prosecuted, and I think James Byrd received the death penalty in Texas. So again, what's really the problem? We have state and local people who have vast experience investigating murders. They quickly investigated and apprehended the perpetrators of those awful crimes and held them to account. That's what we should want. We don't need more federal laws on the books to take care of these situations.
All right, let's let our viewers weigh in. Julia's first. She's a Democrat in Port Arthur, Texas. Go ahead, Julia.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm calling because I'm in support of the gentleman that say there's really not that need for a hate crime law anymore because the law enforcement officers, they are pretty much up to date on what to do as crimes. But my question is, we speak of the inmate that's in prison or in jail on hate crime, but do we look at the administrators and the wardens and et cetera that makes up the people that makes decision over these people? What about them when they commit hate crime laws on inmates? What is done with them when they are all in it together and everybody's covering up for one another and there's nothing done to them, but the inmates get double penalty for whatever they do as far as hate crime?
Okay, well, two different points there, but Winnie Steckelberg, let me ask you to weigh in on what you heard.
Well, I think federal hate crimes laws are meant to apply to everyone equally, and so whether you're in the administration of a prison or whether you're an inmate of the prison, they apply equally. But I think the caller raises an interesting point, which is hate crime violence doesn't pick victims. And so you see perpetrators of hate crime violence at every level of our society. And I have to disagree with my colleague and my friend Tim on this point that it's not about federal law usurping state or local law. In fact, it's about the partnership of local law enforcement working with the federal government to ensure that there's the proper investigation and prosecution of crimes.
The caller also said if you are charged of a hate crime, it's double the charge.
There is a separate sentencing enhancement that can often go along with hate crimes laws, yes.
Tim Lynch?
One of the problems with that is one hate crime law in New Jersey was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because the person was prosecuted for firing a gun into somebody's home. It happened to be the home of African Americans. So they were initially prosecuted for the crime. The jury said he was guilty of the unlawful discharge of a firearm. And so he was convicted of that offense. But when it came time for sentencing, the judge said, I think that this was not just a regular crime, I think it was a hate crime. So he added like 5 more years to the person's sentence. This went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared this hate crime law unconstitutional because it interfered with the right to a jury trial. The court said juries have to decide beyond a reasonable doubt whether it was a hate crime or not. So some of these sentencing enhancement because of hate crimes have been declared unconstitutional by the courts.
Here's how it breaks down state by state. This is from the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. The states in pink, which should include Massachusetts as well, are states with hate crime laws that include crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity. States with pink and white stripes are those with hate crime laws that include crimes based on sexual orientation. There's 18 of them. Purple states are those with hate crime laws that do not include crimes based on sexual orientation or gender identity. There's about 15. And then the darker purple states are states that do not have hate crime laws that include crimes based on any characteristics. Those are 5 states: Arkansas, Georgia, Michigan, South Carolina, and Wyoming. Rick is next in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, Independent. Go ahead, Rick.
Yes, good morning. Here's my problem. It seems to me that the only group that can commit hate crimes or hate crimes can be committed against and there's no charge are heterosexual white males. Every other group has a special designation except for heterosexual white males. If a crime is committed against them, based on, doesn't matter who commits it, there can be no hate crime component. If a heterosexual white male commits a crime against any of the other groups, there's probably automatically going to be a hate crime component put into that.
All right.
That's discrimination.
All right. Tim Lynch, I'll have you weigh in first.
Well, the caller raises an interesting point. We have to remember when it comes to these hate crimes laws, it depends on how they're written. You pointed out that they're passed in all these different states, and sometimes they're written in different ways. And he said it's limited to heterosexual white males. That may be true in a few states, I don't know, but it's controversial when they're being drawn up as to what will be included and what is not. For example, are all rapes going to be considered a hate crime because presumably the person is targeting women because rape is his crime, the one that he wants to commit? If rape is included as a hate crime, that kind of overwhelms all of the other statistics because of those types of crimes. One time a controversy erupted because some criminals in New York City, I think, were targeting the elderly. So is age against the elderly, is that going to be considered a hate crime or not? Depends on how they're written.
Winnie Stackelberg.
Well, Tim uses sort of a red herring argument that was brought up in the years that I worked very hard at the Human Rights Campaign to try to pass and have signed into law what was then called the Local Law Enforcement Enhancement Act, which became the Matthew Shepard Act. People wanted to say that you can't add gender to current hate crimes laws because all rape would then be considered a hate crime. That's not true. That's not what happens. It's not what happened in practice in states, and I think Tim knows that. What you see with federal hate crimes is very few hate crimes are prosecuted at the federal level. There are very few over the last several years, and so this is not an overbroad statute. This is not a statute which leads to additional litigation, as many will claim. What it does is it provides a backstop. It ensures that local law enforcement and the federal government can work together when and if local law enforcement chooses not to prosecute or investigate to the fullest extent.
Let me have you respond to a tweet here who is echoing a point that Tim Lynch brought up. It's Cameron, and he says, isn't any violent crime a hate crime?
No, not all violent crimes are hate crimes. They're not all motivated by animus against a particular group of people. They're motivated by the need for a robbery, a break-in. Those are violent crimes, and they are not motivated by animus towards a group of people. But when you take a look at the brutal killing of James Byrd, that was a crime that was motivated because of animus toward African Americans. It was based on race, and it was proven. Same thing with Matthew Shepard. So these are crimes that are committed not only in a violent way against the victim, but they're meant to send a signal to an entire community. They're very personal. They often are, and FBI statistics show this, they're often more violent than other crimes because of the anger that the perpetrator has, not only toward the victim, but toward the group of people, African Americans, people of different faiths. We saw a spike in hate crime violence against Muslims after 9/11, for example. And so you see that this was perpetrated against a group of people. And while Tim brings up the elderly in New York, if in fact a group of elderly were victimized because of their age, then we ought to take a look at that. I mean, think about what that message would send to our older citizens.
This is
somehow that their status, their age, somehow signals that they are open to being victims of crimes.
This is another area where we disagree. I mean, the person who sent in the tweet, I think, makes a good point. I disagree with Winnie that hate crimes are somehow more violent. There's all types of violent crimes, and the bottom line of hate crimes is that they're saying that crimes that are rooted in hate, that's rooted in jealousy or greed should be treated less severely than hate that arises out of some type of bigotry towards a nationality or sexual orientation. And I don't think we need to set up this hierarchy of hatred in our law. All violent crimes are awful. They're motivated by a host and wide range of reasons, and we should enforce the laws evenly and vigorously against the people who are committing these crimes.
Let me have you both weigh in on the headlines that we're seeing in the papers recently about hate crime laws. It has to do with a case of this ex-Rutgers student who is accused in webcam of spying on his roommate. The roommate later took his own life. He will not be testifying. That's the headline this morning in the papers at his trial. How does this fall under hate crime laws?
Well, it's not a hate crime. I mean, it's a tragic example.
Do you think it should?
No, I don't think it's a hate crime. It's a tragic example of, I think, the internet and cyberbullying and what has become sort of a more pervasive issue. I think it needs to be looked at differently from hate crime violence. But it goes to the motivation. Was Tyler Clemente chosen because of his sexual orientation? Was the perpetrator of the crime trying to send a signal, trying to send a message of hate for an entire community? In this case, the assailant is being accused with invasion of privacy, and it's not a hate crime under the state law in New Jersey.
Tim Lynch, do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I'm just glad we agree that this should not be considered to be a hate crime. And again, I think once the police have determined, that they've got the culprit who's responsible for the criminal act, let's shut them down and, move them off to the prosecutors so that the case can be prosecuted and move the case along. But when you have hate crimes, if the prejudice element of the hate crime law is not obvious, then we have to have investigators spending their time trying to prove that element. And why do we want to divert our police to look into those things when they've already got enough evidence to know who was responsible for the act? We have a lot of violent crimes, and I'd rather see those investigators start following up on leads on other unsolved murders and rapes.
But I think this is where you see that when hate crimes laws are in place and are followed, they're not overbroad. And so I think Tim and I'm not sure whether we agree or we disagree, but that's why I think the federal hate crime statute is exactly right and in place and should be used when necessary.
All right, Teresa's next. She's a Republican in Danridge, Tennessee. Good morning, Teresa. Teresa, you're on the air. Yep, go ahead with your comment, please.
I moved from Tennessee from Georgia, and the majority of violence perpetrated on the white community in Georgia is from African Americans. Flash mobs, they're not considered hate crimes, even though they are specifically targeting white-owned stores, white people. You're doing nothing but dividing us and trying to keep our race relations separate. Why is there no hate crimes when a black perpetrates a crime on a white? It's just racially divided.
Let's take that point. Winnie Stockelberg.
Well, I think the federal hate crime statute says exactly that. It's based on race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, and disability status. And so race, whatever your race is, white or black, is covered under the federal hate crime statute. So if it is proven that these crimes were perpetrated based on animus or on race, they would be subject to the federal hate crimes law.
Gregory, Democrat in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Yes, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I think that we about 45 or 50 years a bit too late thinking about how, it was back in the 60s about hate crime, but late better than never. But I think hate crime should be in place because, the gentleman talking about we don't need a hate crime law, that's just another excuse for the haters, to get away with what they've been getting away with years. Look at the federal judge that made a statement towards the president, anti-Obama. President Obama win the election for 4 more years. Thank God we're going to have them hate crimes and law in place. Thank you for taking my call.
Tim Lynch.
Well, both of the callers, I think, are mistaken in some respects. The woman who called just before this gentleman said that it's only enforced against whites. Hate crimes laws are sometimes enforced against young black men. That was one of the first cases to reach the Supreme Court, was a guy named Todd Mitchell, who was like a young juvenile. And that's where a lot of these hate crimes comes up. It's with high school students and juveniles who get into a scuffle on a basketball court where they sometimes, we use a racial epithet when they're involved in a fight. So these hate crimes laws boomerang, and sometimes African American men get extra time in prison because they uttered some dumb remark during a fight. So both callers, I think, are wrong in that respect. Hate crimes laws are applied against minorities as well, and I don't think it's necessary.
Well, hate crimes laws are applied across the board now, and we see a reduction based on the statistics from the FBI in hate crime violence. I think they're working. It is not a panacea. It is not going to ensure that we don't dislike people and have animus towards people, or that crime somehow vanishes in this country. But it is an additional tool that local law enforcement calls for, and it's an additional signal and message that's sent to especially victimized communities, the gay and lesbian community, the transgender community in particular, that hatred and violence against that community is not okay.
Max Ryan has this tweet: is racial profiling a hate crime?
No, racial profiling is not a hate crime. Is it based on animus towards a race? Yes, but it's not a hate crime. I mean, when we see police departments conducting racial profiling, they're not brought up on hate crimes laws. They have other laws to prosecute those perpetrators.
Tim Lynch, you brought up the Supreme Court. Tell our viewers how the court has weighed on this issue, voted on this issue in the past.
Well, the hate crimes laws have kept the Supreme Court busy because I think it's wreaking havoc with our Constitution. At first, there's the constitutional principle of federalism, which basically divides responsibilities between the federal government and the state government. And under our Constitution, crime fighting, it's an important governmental responsibility, but it's mostly to be handled by state and local law enforcement. So we had a Violence Against Women Act designed to fight bias crimes against women, declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in a case called Morrison in the year 2000. I mentioned the case called Apprendi, where the Supreme Court declared a New Jersey hate crime law unconstitutional because it violated the right to trial by jury. And there was another Supreme Court case declaring a Minnesota hate crime law unconstitutional because it violated free speech. It targeted certain expressive forms of conduct that was kind of hateful, but under our free speech principles, we allow people to even express hateful types of speech. So the hate crimes laws have kept our courts busy, and they're declaring these things unconstitutional in a variety of respects. The federal hate crime law that Winnie was talking about was just signed into law by President Obama in 2009, and a federalism challenge has not yet reached the Supreme Court for that one.
Winnie, can I have you weigh in on this? Because this person tweets in, KP Potatoes, who says, hate crime laws introduce a ton of subjectivity into the criminal law.
No, they don't introduce subjectivity. What they do is they enable judges and law enforcement to use all the tools available. You have to understand, with all of our laws, if the call, by subjectivity, I believe the caller means you have to think about the motives for crime. And whether that's objective or subjective, we could have that argument. But we have different levels of murder, first degree, second degree, and third degree, which goes to the motivations behind that crime. So motivations are considered in all levels of our criminal system, no different from hate crimes. And so Tim would like us to think that you shouldn't be able to go into what is motivating a criminal to act. And I think that's where we disagree. Like the caller suggests, I think you do have to go into what is motivating the criminal to act. And with respect to hate crimes, you do have to figure out whether the person is motivated not just to perpetrate a crime against an individual, but that crime is meant to send a signal to an entire group of people. And again, going back to Matthew Shepard, going back to James Byrd in Texas, those crimes were meant to send a signal not just to the victim of that crime, but to an entire community of people, and that's wrong.
But the problem is that you cannot always attribute the prejudice to the culprit. You know, you might have a blatant instance where somebody has a baseball bat and they're beating somebody over the head and said, "I hate Asians," and there's lots of witnesses, so we kind of know what was going on in that person's mind when he committed that crime. But they're not, the normal cases are not so obvious. So I think what the tweeter is getting at is that when you don't have the person verbally expressing his hatred while he's committing the crime forces investigators, oh, we think this might be a hate crime. Let's see what's in his house. Let's see what magazines, what posters are on the wall. Maybe we can discern a prejudice by what we find in the person's house. And I think that's the subjectivity that the tweeter is getting at. Are we going to draw conclusions on that type of evidence to say that this person not only committed a regular crime but committed a hate crime?
But that's how our criminal justice system works. You go into a house and you look for evidence. What is the motivation behind a crime? Did the person, was it a crime of passion? Was it something that was premeditated? The criminal justice system does that all the time. And so I don't understand why Tim thinks that for hate crime violence, for that violence against a particular individual that's meant to send a signal to a group, that they should be treated differently. We go to motivation all the time in criminal justice.
We're talking about hate crime laws in the United States. Here is a state-by-state breakdown. There are 12 states and the District of Columbia here in pink. Let me add Massachusetts to that list. That would make 13, with hate crime laws that include crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity. There are also federal laws. Let me go back to our callers. Valerie in Independent, Winslow, New Jersey. You're up next.
Good morning. And being a 40-plus-year-old transgendered woman, I have a perspective. I have a few quick comments and a general question for both of your guests, if you can, and I'll be brief. First off, I'm a little disappointed with Mr. Lynch's commentary on this whole subject. He seems to be portraying the information somewhat broadly and inaccurately. My understanding is that a hate crime is a hate crime because the motivation of the crime is itself the hateful nature of it. In other words, you target someone that's gay or someone that's lesbian or someone that's black or whatever because of that particular characteristic that puts them in a group, usually a minority. And so that's the impetus for the crime. It's not that you're robbing a black person, so we'll say, well, because he's black, we're going to make it a hate crime also. It's that you're going after that person because of their minority status. That's what I understand it to be, number one.
All right, Valerie, let me take that point and have Tim Lynch respond to it.
Well, the caller has put her finger on why people want these laws and why they push to have these laws enacted. But again, there's lots of controversy over what should be included in the laws and what should not be. For example, last year there was an awful violent crime at Los Angeles baseball stadium a year ago. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a Giant fan walking through the parking lot. He had his Giant jersey on. And apparently this rivalry is so intense that some of the Los Angeles fans were so offended by his swagger, his willingness to come into their stadium wearing Giants jersey, that they targeted him and beat him up. He was a paramedic, father of 2, and he was beaten into a coma. And we know he was targeted for no other reason than his sports affiliation, another stupid, violent crime. Why should this crime be treated any differently? Because the hatred was motivated by some stupid sports motivation than because he was targeted because of his ethnicity.
Winnie, I'll give you the next phone call. We'll go to Houston, who is a Republican in New Orleans. Go ahead.
Yes, listen, there should be, all of it starts from a psychological viewpoint, simply because it's motivated in the mind. All of it is hate. You know, I'm 78 years old, and when I go to work, I almost have to fight some of the young folks that's there. It's something that's in their mind that is against the elder. I've had right before Carnival, somebody cut 4 of my tires on my car. You know, so it's psychological, and the gentleman seemed to be too liberal in his definitions. I wouldn't want him for my lawyer. Thank you.
Well, let me respond by saying, you mentioned, the caller mentions cutting his tires, and I'm certainly sorry for that. I think there's vandalism, and then there is spray painting. Going back to Tim's point, Giants versus Dodgers is one thing, but spray painting a swastika on a temple, on a synagogue, is something else. And so there really are very, very different issues at play here. We worked a lot with the Anti-Defamation League, for example, in passing the federal hate crime statute, not just when Tim said when it was signed into law, but for the 14 years before that. And ADL really is amazing organization that tracks the kind of hatred and hate crime violence and helps work with the FBI to train law enforcement to assess what's at play, what motivations are at play when it comes to hate crime violence. And I mean, I've got to say that as we've seen that hate crime statutes are not overused and hate crimes are actually going down. So I've got to put my faith in the laws to send signals to people that animosity and animus towards anyone is not okay.
Okay, we'll go to North Carolina, New Bern, North Carolina. William is next, Democratic caller.
Good morning. How you doing?
Morning.
Okay, now listen, there are so many laws have been made, but here's a law I suggest. Once you make a law, it shouldn't be that some can opt out of it or something obey by it. All laws should be made to admit to it. Here's what I suggest. That it would take Rush Limbaugh, Bob McDonough, and Roy Blunt. They agree on different laws and stuff. What we should do is ultrasound them. Take them and ultrasound them because they'll love to do that. Not only those three, but ultrasound all the Republicans until you go through the whole charade of them.
All right, caller, got your point. Here's Deborah in a tweet here for you, Tim Lynch. Hate crime laws are recourse for those who have been cumulatively disadvantaged by law that caters to those with cumulative advantage.
Well, again, I know that's one of the reasons that these laws are put forward, but again, I go back to the basic points that all violent acts, any violent act that you can think of, it's already against the law. When it comes to violent acts, this is the one thing that should unite us all across, across the political spectrum, should unite all people of all different religions and races. That violence is unacceptable, and they should be these criminal laws should be enforced evenly. We do not need to set up some kind of hierarchy of hatred into a law. I think that just creates divisiveness, like some of the earlier callers were making the point that, well, why is this treated as a hate crime and this isn't? And I think it will lead to more divisiveness. People will want the FBI involved in their case. And the federal law was enacted specifically because they want to be able to bring into federal court somebody who may have been acquitted of a hate crime at the state level. And that undermines the double jeopardy principle of our Constitution. We should not just think about the people who are the victims of the crimes. We definitely have to take them into consideration, but we also have to take a look at our entire system and the people who are going to be accused of these crimes. Having this double jeopardy principle undermined is another basic constitutional principle that I think is undermined by these laws.
Orion tweets in, hate crimes are on the decline because our culture is maturing, believe it or not. You cited the FBI statistics. However, there is this headline from the New York Times recently that the number of U.S. hate groups are rising.
That is a sad fact that hate crimes laws, whether they're at the local, state, or federal level, are not going to rid this country or this world of hate groups or of hatred. But if they can provide an additional tool to help prosecute and investigate, if they can help ensure that all communities feel safe, and I've got to disagree with Tim. The hate crimes, if you take a look at sort of the federal hate crimes statute that was just signed into law by President Obama in 2009, it was modernized. There were holes in it. Gender identity and sexual orientation were not included, and it was very clear from FBI statistics that those were populations that were being targeted. And so, rather than this this is pitting one group against another, it's actually modernizing our approach to law enforcement.
Kevin is in independent Niagara Falls, New York.
Hello.
Morning, Kevin.
God bless you. And I'm thankful. God bless Keystone. When you have a group of people, okay, like that gentleman who was targeted, and they literally went out and looked for a black man, chained him to the back of his truck, and drug him until his head fell off. I don't see how this gentleman could defend that not being a hate crime when they went out and said, okay, let's find a black person to kill. If you're going to do it, and it goes both ways. If a black man goes out and says, you know what, just because I don't like white people, the first person I see after dark, I'm going to shoot him. He ought to do as many years behind bars as they ought to make him stand there and hold bars until they build a jail around him.
Tim Lynch.
Well, the caller's a little bit confused because about my position, because I certainly wouldn't deny what was going on in the James Byrd case. People sometimes clearly target ethnicities and race, and so there is racial crime. People are targeted, so he's mixed up about that. But my point was that the people responsible for that awful criminal act were quickly apprehended and they were prosecuted for murder. That's what should have happened. So we didn't need a hate crime in order to address that problem.
Are there actual costs, dollars, to having hate crime laws that you're opposed to?
I don't think cost is the main issue here. Some of the federal hate crimes laws involve special grants to local law enforcement agencies. I think it will involve some additional investigative resources. As I was saying earlier, detectives need to be dispatched to go out and prove and gather evidence to prove that this was a hate crime. So there's some costs there, but I don't think that's the major issue here.
If I could just jump in, I think, you know, the murder of James Byrd, I think, sadly, is a tragic example of why hate crime laws are needed. Because, yes, Tim is right that the perpetrators were brought to justice. But what's important in a case like that is not only that the criminals are put behind bars for life, but that a signal is sent to all African Americans, to the entire community, that that is not okay. Not only is not killing a black man not okay, but targeting African Americans, targeting people for their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, that is not okay in this society.
But anybody who is so twisted as to think that they can, you know, they're going to stab another person, shoot another person, drag a person behind a truck, anybody who thinks that they're going to stop, you know, put down the knife or gun because a new hate crimes law is on the books is sadly mistaken. It's just not going to happen.
We'll get a couple more phone calls in here if we can. Winnie Stuckelberg, though, I want to ask you first, what's next on the hate crime law front? What's happening?
Training local law enforcement on the implementation of it. To speak to a number of the callers and those who have tweeted about this morning, what you've got to do is ensure that local law enforcement, those on the front lines of our criminal justice system, are actually trained to know what a hate crime is and what one isn't, and how to help prevent them, how to talk to community leaders to ensure that we have the proper training. And again, the Anti-Defamation League is one of the groups that works with the FBI to do that.
Tim Lynch, what are you watching for next?
Well, we're watching to see how these laws are enforced. We're watching the constitutional challenges that I spoke about earlier. Yeah. I think the federal hate crimes law violates the constitutional principle of federalism.
You expect that to go to the Supreme Court?
Eventually. The law was just enacted in 2009, and a lot of the cases involve plea bargains, so they have not worked their way up to the appellate courts. But eventually, one will reach the Supreme Court. They declared the Violence Against Women Act unconstitutional on federalism grounds, and I think the same thing would happen with this law.
Okay. One last, maybe two if we can. Penny, a Democrat in Ireland, West Virginia. Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a little bit different one here for you. I'm just the opposite. I'm white. I'm not an albino, but I'm really close. A doctor stole eggs from me in 1993, and I can't get no help. There's no law against it in West Virginia. I've been brutalized repeatedly because of my coloring. The gays and the women for, you know, reproductive rights and that, they can't help me because it didn't apply to abortion. And then I had the discrimination. I'm too white. I don't have pigmentation, or a very lack of it anyway. I want someone to help me.
Winnie Stuckelberg.
Well, I feel for the caller in West Virginia, and it would seem to me that the state laws there banning discrimination based on your gender, based on and criminal acts that your health care system has not provided would be a backstop for you.
Middlebury, Massachusetts. Eddie, a Republican. You're last. Go ahead, Eddie.
Good morning.
Morning.
my question is about jury nullification. Now, it was said if a white policeman in the Bronx shoots a black man, he will not go before a jury. He would rather be judged by jurors of judges. And then it's the O.J. Simpson case, jury nullification. He definitely was guilty, but could the feds have brought him to trial for the crime?
Tim Lynch, anything there you can respond to?
Well, I think his last comment about the O.J. Simpson case shows how divisive I think these laws can be, because when he was talking about if we have a federal law, then we can have another prosecution. And we normally think of these cases like with the Rodney King case. Remember those white LAPD police officers were initially acquitted in California court. Then when they were brought into federal court where they were convicted, now you have to think of the flip side of that. I'm talking about, he mentioned the O.J. Simpson case. Can you imagine if, like, John Ashcroft was a very divisive figure during the Bush administration? He was the Attorney General. Can you imagine if he moved in after O.J. Simpson had been acquitted and said, well, now we're going to prosecute him for a hate crime in federal court? We had Michael Jackson and Kobe Bryant accused of crimes, but they were acquitted. Can you imagine if a John Ashcroft came in and said, we're going to prosecute them in federal court after they've been acquitted? It's going to create more divisiveness and racial strife in the United States rather than less.
Winnie Stuckelberger, I want to get your final thoughts, and then we need to wrap up.
Well, I mean, those are all sort of examples that haven't happened. But I think what we see here with whether it's hate crime laws or many of the callers is that people are looking for ways not to divide our country based on race or religion or any other factor. And again, hate crime laws are not the way to solve all of those problems, but they certainly help. They send a message, and they're working. They're actually reducing hate crime violence in this country.
Winnie Stuckelberg, Tim Lynch, thank you both for talking about this with our viewers. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.